know who has access to what? If you are looking for identity and access management talk, you have come to the right place. This is the Identity at the Center podcast. Hosts Jeff Stedman and Jim McDonald are strategic advisors with Identity's advisory services practice and are here to talk about a wide range of identity and access management topics. Comments, questions, and accolades can all be sent to identityatthecenter.com. And now, on to the show.
Welcome to episode 4 of Identity at the Center. Jim, you've been working on a blog around the cyclical nature of identity governance. Do you want to give people a sneak peek of what that is?
Sure. So this is a blog, Jeff, I want to pitch to you. Get your feedback and get some, hopefully I'm going to publish it in the next week or two, unless it's a total stinker. Got to go back to the drawing board. But what I like to do with my blogs, I like to lean on, actually the way I look at things when we're doing our consulting engagements. And so since I'm kind of the more technical guy in our group, I like to, go in and spend a lot of time looking at the architecture of things. And so this blog is about kind of the architecture of identity administration and governance. So that's what the space is called, identity governance and administration. A lot of the clients we work with are doing identity administration, I would say, at some form or another. But the idea of the circle is that, there's really two parts to that. Identity administration is what should be, you're somewhere centrally saying, Jeff has this entitlement, and then what actually is. So eventually that Jeff gets an account in an end system and has a role or entitlement in that system. And what sometimes can happen is if there's not the circle, what should be and what actually is can get out of sync. And that's mostly because if there's any kind of backdoor administration taking place on the end system, accounts can get added or removed. So I guess that's the idea, is that there's, that's what I look for, is that there is a closed loop in this process. So let me bounce that off you. Do you think that I'm onto something there?
Yeah, there's definitely something there with the cycle. It's difficult sometimes to come up with a new paradigm for measuring this type of stuff, right? Or concepts, et cetera, because it feels like there's so many of these out there and there's very tried but true ones. So how does your circle start?
Okay, so I've got 4 parts. So it's what I call approve, provision, then collect, and verify. And so it starts with approve. And the idea is that approve breaks down into 2 parts, the identity and the access. So approve could be a physical approval or an implied approval. And when I'm talking about the identity, the idea is that the identity would be coming in from either an authoritative source, such as an HR system, or it could be getting manually created in, say, the identity management tool. Somebody could be coming in and saying, I just hired a new contractor, for example, and they need to be set up. I need to, create an account for this person and then, get them access to X, Y, and Z systems. So, okay. Starting with that identity, having the approval come from either an authoritative source, which here's what I find. I'd like to know how you think about this, but most organizations are using that they have a good authoritative source for employees, which is the HR system. And then when it gets outside of that group, whether it's contingent workers or guests or board of directors or whatever user populations they're dealing with other than employees, it gets a little more murky.
Yeah. It's very, I would say, not as mature definitely as what the employees typically have for whatever reason. And this is nothing new and probably not shocking people who are listening to this, right? Employees are typically well managed. Non-employees, it's really kind of a crapshoot. Some folks do a good job of it and they have very similar process. Others, they don't, right? They're using a spreadsheet. They don't have unique identifiers. It's really just not great.
Yeah.
but there's a lot of ways that could be solved around that. You could always try to put them in the HR system, but that tends to be a protracted battle that you may or may not win depending on the position of HR, right? You can put them in a spreadsheet. This is kind of the manual, dirty way of it, but doesn't really scale very well. Or you can build something, which is something that comes up quite a bit, where typically the IAM team, and by extension IT, has to manage non-employee identities in some way because of the lack of a centralized tool to do that. Then you've got the third, what we'll call like third parties, right? Like Fieldglass and kind of like other systems that specialize in non-employee management.
Right.
So, but all of those could be tied to some level of approval, right? To get into that authoritative system.
Right. Yeah. And I'll tell you, so there's another use case that came to my mind was universities, where they could have people who are members of the community who they allow to get library cards. So this was a scenario that I actually ran into with a client where they have, a website where people can go up and sign up for an account. And just having that account gives them very rudimentary access. But the implied approval is it's a low level of affiliation. It doesn't require any kind of identity proofing process. And really, until they kind of up-level that account, they're not going to be able to do a whole lot with it anyway. So the approval is implied in that, okay, we're not too worried if people go and create an account and check out a library book.
Yeah, and the risk is probably low too, right? At that point, if it's something implied, it's a service or access that's generally not needed to be secured. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, exactly. And really, I think, so, in terms of the blog, in terms of, this idea that I'm pitching the idea is that we have to go in and look and make sure that the identities are coming through some process, and that the process, the level of risk is appropriate with the level of approval that it goes through, whether that's implied or somebody, there is some kind of workflow where the person's actually approving the identity. Again, the identity is tied off to a human being in most cases, or the identity could be tied off to kind of an IoT type device. The next thing, though, is around it within that approved space is now giving the person access. And so, we have the identity, and let's say, for example, the identity is a person who lives in Boston or works out of the Boston office. And based on that, they could be granted, so say they're an employee in the Boston office, and based on that, they could be given access, given an account in Active Directory and added to a few groups, given an account in the travel management system and to the employee portal and to some, the parking system in the Boston office, things like that. Again, that's kind of an implied approval because, or what we would call kind of like birthright access. And the other way would be what I call ad hoc approval or ad hoc access requests, where they go in and somebody requests access for them, or they request access, and manual approval is required. So if they need access to the finance system, perhaps their manager would request it for them before they even show up for the first day, and the person who is responsible for that accounting system would have to go ahead and approve that access.
You're putting an awful lot of faith in managers doing that before for their first day of starting.
It is. But the idea, at least in terms of the blog, is not to dig into too much detail, but more or less to say, okay, those are processes that we have to look at, make sure that they're appropriate, make sure there's appropriate level of automation, and that there's a paper trail.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, that was probably more of a dig towards managers not doing what they're supposed to do, which is what every IAM person feels like is not happening. Right? They don't put terminations in time. They don't request access. From my operations background, it's Friday, 4:00, and I have a person starting on Monday. Let me put this access request in. It's like, okay, you didn't know that 2 weeks ago. So no, I get it.
Stamping too.
Yeah, exactly. So then you start rushing things.
And maybe
Okay.
a future blog topic, Jeff, would be, I saw a really good presentation someone did at a conference. I'll have to dig it up. I don't remember who it was or even what company they were from, but it'd be a great one to do a blog on, which was the idea that they were moving toward things where if the risk was low enough that they would just let approvals go through. And because the idea is that some managers get asked to approve access, to dozens of systems and hundreds of times a week, or even if it's not that much, at some point you get to the point where you're just like, enough is enough, I'm just going to approve. Whereas if you know the only time that approval requests ever come to you is when the risk is high enough, you're going to take it more seriously.
Yeah, I feel like that's almost its own topic itself, right? Is that whole approval inundation that sometimes people get, and that could be for the manager, it could be for an access owner or a data owner. I mean, really, the whole intent of the reason you want to send an approval out is to make sure it's appropriate. If it's always appropriate, then there needs to be some sort of implied situation. Maybe it's a role or attribute or something that becomes the trigger to get that access and doesn't require approval. And I almost treat it like a birthright, or a predefined role that gets reviewed every once in a while. But yeah, spam from your IAM system is never a good thing. So you want to make sure that you're only sending things out when it's absolutely needed.
Yeah, if things from your IAM system are ending up in people's junk mail, that's a problem.
Yeah, then you got a problem for sure. Okay, so that's approve. What's the next thing on your cycle of IGA?
So the approve step really gets them into the should be. So if you went into that IAM system and said, what access does Jim have? You should be able to go and see a full list of all the accounts and entitlements I have. Now we need to somehow get that from the identity management system over into the applications. And I call this area provision. So the idea here is, how do we go ahead and take that and put it into the application or platform? And, the best case scenario is that most of that is automated. I don't, when I look at an organization's process for provisioning, I don't expect them to be 100% automated, but the more automated they are, the better. So there's automated and manual. In terms of automated, kind of within the blog, I was thinking about going through and talking about the different types of automation. I've got proprietary provisioning connectors, using APIs, what I call least common denominator, which is sending flat files. There's custom processes, which a lot of times will be in place for custom applications. Enterprise service bus, so a lot of organizations using ESB, and then just-in-time provisioning. So if you're using some kind of single sign-on system based on the SAML 2.0 standard, you can use the just-in-time provisioning calls to create an account and define a role or entitlement through that call. So it could get really deep. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of different ways of provision. I wonder if there's a way to simplify it in a way that API covers more than one area, because it's really kind of, when I think of API, I think of the kind of the programmatic way to do a provisioning. What about manual provisioning? Because, like I said, not every company is going to be automated, and I don't think there is it doesn't make sense to automate something that has like 3 users in it, sending a ticket to the appropriate queue for provisioning or email, or something like that. Maybe that can be included.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes when I start these blogs, they end up as 10 pages. I'm like, no, this is way too much data, right? I get on these tangents. So yeah, in terms of the automated provisioning, I just rattled off a whole bunch of ways that it could be done. Manual, I think, is a little more simple in that I think the right ways to do it are to integrate into a a ticketing system like a ServiceNow, and drop a provisioning event in the right queue for the right, for the provisioners to go and fetch their ticket, go ahead and create the access, create the account, and go back and close the ticket within ServiceNow, and have ServiceNow go back to your identity management tool and say, the work's been done.
Now, where would you put the approval in that step? Would it, what would carry the approval? Would it be something before ServiceNow, for example, or do you have the approval within ServiceNow?
So I think a lot of organizations really want to do everything within ServiceNow. So they want to have even the access request generated in ServiceNow, use ServiceNow's workflows, and et cetera. And, I see that done and it can be successful. So I guess within the scope of what this blog is, that's fine. But really the way I see most organizations who have invested in an identity management system is that workflow for requesting and approving access will happen within the identity management system's user interface. It will send a ticket then to ServiceNow to the provisioner. The provisioner will go ahead and do the work and close the ticket. And then ServiceNow will send a message back to the identity management system saying the work has been completed.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's something that typically most teams want to see is don't give me work that's not approved. The assumption would be that if I receive a ticket in that scenario, I don't need to chase down approvals, right? I can just do the work. It certainly decreases things like SLA that are typically how those groups might get measured. How quickly does this ticket get worked? I know I've had this challenge quite a bit is in the past is, we're waiting on approval for a manager and a manager either, doesn't respond or they're on vacation or, something, and it starts to throw SLAs out of whack and so forth. So my assumption given this cycle would be that the approval step is happening in your first part. And when you get to the provision step, the provision is carrying out the approval or carrying out the provisioning associated with that approval. Is that right?
That's exactly right. That's how I was thinking about it.
Okay.
The only other kind of sub-point on the manual is that some organizations don't have ServiceNow or don't have as much of a drive to say, all right, we want all of our provisioning tickets to end up there. And a lot of identity management tools will have kind of the same ability to create a ticket, email the provisioners, somebody to come back and claim that ticket, work it, and close it all within the identity management tool. So you don't necessarily have to have an external system, but I'd say the majority of organizations that I think are kind of in a mature and good place with manual provisioning have that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's not everyone's going to have ServiceNow or ticketing system, emails. But I think that's kind of irrelevant really at that point, right? You're acting on a piece of work that is pre-approved. I think that's probably the key there, whether it's manual or even if it's something that's going programmatically API, flat file, whatever it is, the approval step has already taken place. So it's okay to grant this access because that was taken care of.
Right, exactly. And so now I think we're still kind of within the bounds of how things should be. Now, if we're automated, if we're doing the administration and identity management tool, and the tool is then provisioning accounts into the platform, we should have a good picture, 100% of what should actually be as it is. At the same time, most systems have some kind of backdoor where you could go and create additional accounts, create service accounts, create administrative accounts, essentially create any type of account. And this is where, so I feel like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where identity management systems were, focused on, we're going to put administration in the center and we're going to get really good at provisioning out. Then along came identity governance. And the identity governance focus was accounts have already been created out in all the applications and platforms. We're going to pull those in, correlate them, and give you a picture of who has access to what. So that's kind of the second part, which is, or I should say the third step in my cycle is that we're actually doing that. We're going out and collecting from systems what actually is, who actually has, what are the accounts and entitlements that are actually within your system. Or pull those back, and we're going to correlate them back to a single person. And then the final.
For the security. this is where the security hits the road, right? I mean, this is where you catch accounts that were created out of band and didn't follow the process, which is an indicator of compromise if you're looking at it from that angle too. And you're totally right on. I think this was like a big selling point like 5-10 years ago was, the out of band account creation. And this is a key part of pulling that information in, right? Who has access to what? And if you've got an access out there that you can't associate with an identity, whether it's a person or a service or whatever it may be, you better shut that down, right? Or figure out who it belongs to pretty quickly, because it could be something that's not of a good nature.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if somebody's going to audit the access processes for an IT system, they're not going to go to your central database of what should be. They're going to go to what actually is.
Right.
If there are differences between what should be and what actually is, that's where you're going to start running into issues when things start happening out of band. If everybody's doing their job and following their process the way it's defined, great. But administrators sometimes have to work outside the process, or at least that's what they tell themselves. Having been on that side of the fence, I know when you're in the middle of, solving an issue, or, the CEO's admin assistant calls you and says they need an account right away, you're motivated to just get that account created. You're not too worried about making sure that the audit is going to be airtight 6 months down the road. So the idea, again, on the cycle is that you're going out and you're getting the as is. And then the last step that I had that in this loop was verify. So it's really just taking the as is, bouncing it up against the should be, and finding the differences. So if you have accounts that were created out of band, that somebody is taking those up and doing something with them. And then the other part to verify is that even the accounts that are matching up and everything looks right, is that on a periodic basis, this is the access governance step, on a periodic basis, somebody like a manager of that person or somebody who's responsible for that application is reviewing access and making sure that the right people have the access that they should.
Yeah, I suspect that when you have a mixed environment, meaning automated provisioning and manual provisioning, one of the things you're going to have to watch out for between the collect and the verify stages there would be the drift between when something is and when something shouldn't be, right? So, let's say I'm terminated and all my accounts need to be removed, and everything gets removed except this one account, but that group or person that is supposed to, is responsible for removing that one account is either behind or on vacation or, whatever it may be, has an SLA. There needs to be some way to kind of factor that into the verify and the collect stage to say, okay, we know that Active Directory is automated and that the time for termination is, milliseconds, right, for that to take place. But for, I'll just pick something, Concur, right, which is maybe manually provisioned at the time, it's not going through some sort of connection already. The finance team needs to manually remove that.
Right.
I think that kind of stuff needs to be documented and understood. And then also point in time, how do you catch the ones that exist, just briefly, where it was created and 5 minutes later it's gone. I think that's where analytics, would typically come in. And you need to have more of a real-time feed to catch those if you're looking for, these ephemeral accounts, maybe that only exist for a few minutes, maybe in between cycles, right? I think most people, they run their HR processes overnight, typically with IGA, and there may be a situation where an account, lived for 6 hours and was gone the next day, and no one would be the wiser for it unless that somehow comes up as part of, a data collection that's more real time.
That's right. Another interesting use case is, say you have a SAP system, for example, that's integrated with Active Directory for single sign-on. So the person logs in with an AD account and they have a profile in SAP. If your SLA is like, hey, this person's gone, we want their SAP access cut off immediately. There's really two areas. One is if you get that SSO account, their Active Directory account shut off immediately, for all intents and purposes, they can't get in. At the same time, you need to go and clean up that account on the SAP side, but the SLA could be a little bit longer. It could be a little more forgiving.
Yeah, the security issue is mitigated because of the single sign-on. But then, in the case of SAP, for example, and in other systems, there's still an account out there. You probably pay for a license for it, right? SAP license can be expensive depending on who the license is for, and there's a whole cottage industry around even just the license management component of it. But yeah, I think if you have a well diagrammed kind of architected authentication structure where you're hinging things as much as you can off a single ID, most auditors are going to be accepting of, okay, we know that the access is no longer there. There may be a secondary finding to say, okay, the account wasn't removed, but the security risk has been addressed because that account is inaccessible, which will typically pass, most audits, except for maybe the most stringent where they're looking specifically at a system or if there's a backdoor way in to authenticate with that account. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, and so the purpose of the blog is really just for somebody who is thinking about their architecture, thinking about, their approach to identity management. And, because I don't think this circle gets completed by accident. This is something that you need to kind of plan out and think about in those terms. Again, that's as kind of, I don't want to toot my own horn, but as an expert in this space, that's kind of what I would be looking at as an outsider coming into an organization. Is this cycle completing? Are you managing access and then verifying, kind of that everything that should be actually is and nothing more? And hopefully somebody can look at this blog and say, now I'm going to look at my own architecture and make sure that I've got that kind of circle in place.
Mm-hmm. So we've got to prove, provision, collect, and then verify. And really, in my mind, it's really kind of the repeatable, scalable process. No matter really how you're doing each of those steps, at least you're following those steps to be able to show that accurate, life cycle from an identity perspective. Is that? Am I getting that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So now we need a cool name for it, like the Jimmy Max Circle of IAM, something like that.
Yeah, I'm waiting for Ash to rename this blog, and his titles are very informative, but I come up with something squishy like the IDM Circle, and yours is even more squishy, Jimmy Max IDM Circle or something.
Yeah, well, this is an insight to a Slack conversation the other day, but, I think Ash said, I'm paraphrasing, but Ash said something along the lines of, Jim, your content's great, but your titles suck.
Yeah, pretty much that was it. Well, we'll see, man. I mean, I'd rather have good content and bad titles than the other way around.
Yeah, well, I'm curious to see how it comes together. I mean, I think it's definitely onto something, and I think people will find it helpful, even just from an education standpoint, because sometimes a lot of these steps maybe get lost in the chaff of just doing your day to day. These are the things that need to be in place no matter where you are in your IAM journey. Either you're just starting out or you've been doing it for a while. These are kind of the fundamentals of an IGA lifecycle.
Yeah. Jeff, one thing I know we've tried to encourage with this podcast, and I'd like to just reiterate it, is that if folks are listening to this, and I would imagine as we're talking through this, people are yelling into their Bluetooth or whatever, talk about this or what about this? We'd love to hear that feedback, questions or comments, and ideas for additional podcasts. It's good to know people are listening. So, I'd love to hear any kind of feedback that we can get on this topic or any others.
Yep. And I'll make sure that there's that information on how to get to us. It's questions@identityatthecenter.com. Feel free to shoot over an email to that. Jim and I will take a look at it, and we'll either incorporate it as part of, a future episode or, address it directly. But I'll put that information into the show notes. So that way, it's handy there for reference. And we also record this separately, but publish it on Anchor. and they have like a voicemail kind of system. So if you're using Anchor .fm, you can essentially click a button and leave a voicemail for us. And, maybe we'll play the voicemail and do like a Q&A mailbag or something like that at some point. And, take it from there.
That would be cool.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're in a pretty good spot for today. We'll go ahead and close it out. And thank you, Jim, for that insight into what is coming through next on your blog cycle. And we'll talk to everyone later. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. To access all episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.